Welcome to my podcast on the anti-imperialism of fools. I hope you find it of some use. Leon Trotsky in 1934 remarked the following: "Theoretical sloppiness always takes cruel vengeance in revolutionary politics." There are three components to my talk. Firstly, important principles of Marxism on the question of war, and therein imperialism and anti-imperialism. Secondly, an examination of key political tenets of the left vanguard of Britain's anti-war movement since 9/11, specifically the politics of the Socialist Workers' Party, the SWP, and their initiative Stop the War Coalition on this question of war, and again therein imperialist and anti-imperialist struggles. And finally, a conclusion on the immense importance of the politics of workers' liberty in today's political climate, both domestically and internationally. Firstly then, on principles of Marxism on war, imperialism and anti-imperialism. In 1969, the US Marxist Hal Draper observed that a defeat for American imperialism abroad can have the effect of galvanising opposition to American capitalism domestically. This is a principle that I think we could similarly apply to other imperialist states today. But this does not automatically imply that revolutionary socialists should, on this basis alone, offer political support and, wherever possible, military support to any anti-imperialist struggle. Why? He remarks, well, one possible domestic outcome is not the only possible outcome, and while a number of phenomena might aid revolutionary conditions such as hyper-capitalist exploitation or depression, we don't offer support to these things. But most importantly, the decision itself must be made independently of any two or more sides in a conflict. It must be made in the collective interests of workers internationally. Now, it may well be that the same decision is reached to agitate for the victory of the opposing camp in the defeat of the imperialist camp. But the process and politics within this process in reaching this decision is crucial. What Draper is motivating here is a very familiar Marxist stance that if war is a continuation of politics by other forceful means, one's attitude towards a war must be congruent with one's attitude towards the politics of which it is the continuation. Now, for this reason, he spells out, in fact, during war, revolutionary socialists should not offer political solidarity to an organisation, movement or government simply on the basis that it is an enemy of our enemy, simply on the basis that it has widespread support, simply on the basis that it is in or is likely to be in power, simply on the basis that it formally adopts a political programme ostensibly unobjectionable, simply on the basis that it is successful in winning over more politically progressive elements than its leadership. The decision to offer political solidarity must be on the basis of what is analysed as, I quote, the real political character and real political programme of this formation. Leon Trotsky in the years 1938 to 1939 wrote the following: "The attempt of the bourgeoisie during its internecine conflicts to oblige all of humanity to divide up into only two camps is motivated by a desire to prohibit the proletariat from having its own independent ideas. No one is obliged to become a Marxist, no one is obliged to swear by Lenin's name, but the whole of the politics of these two titans of revolutionary thought was directed towards this: that the fetishism of two camps would give way to a third independent sovereign camp of the proletariat, that camp upon which, in point of fact, the future of humanity depends." Let's translate this into the present. When a major imperialist power poses a choice of the moment as between the civilised and the barbaric, the good and the evil, or any kind of similar such framing, this bourgeois dual camp is not a choice, is not a construction of our making. Its fetishism should be surpassed by seeking out a third independent force, independent force of politics. A force of politics that is by and for the collective and international interests of workers, feminists, secularists, leftists, consistent Democrats. Such an independent force of politics isn't simply an aspiration, although it is a big aspiration, but it's not simply an aspiration. This is a living reality too. Almost immediately after 9/11 and the commencement of the war on terror, there were independent forces out there that demanded our solidarity. The Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, the Labour Party of Pakistan, the Worker Communist Parties of Iran and Iraq, the Iraqi Freedom Congress, the Women's Freedom of Iraq organisation. All of these forces courageously working towards a politics unconstrained by the existing two dominant sides of the respective wage conflicts, imperialism and Islamist so-called anti-imperialism. Such struggles receive little to no profile or solidarity throughout the recent history of the SWP vanguard of Britain's anti-war movement. Why? Because there is an inverted dual camp that has been brought into play within this anti-war movement. And it is a dual camp of my enemy's enemy is my friend. And it's at this point I want to turn to the second part of my talk to examine the key political tenets of the left vanguard of Britain's anti-war movement post 9/11. Specifically the politics of the SWP and their initiative, the Stop the War Coalition. The SWP vanguard of Britain's contemporary anti-war movement adopts a formula of barbarity breeds counter-barbarity, and it develops its logic into a framing of the world into, if you like, a socialistic David versus Goliath. It's an inverted dual camp without a systematic examination of the politics that flows from the Davids and the Goliaths. A statement was released by the SWP Central Committee the day after 9/11. In this statement, the following was asked: is it so surprising that some group in rage and desperation at American policies around the world should have chosen to turn its own methods against the US itself? Yesterday's attacks were in fact a stark revelation of the nature of global capitalism. Our rulers believed that they could preside over a world heaving poverty, suffering and injustice, and yet insulate their own metropolis from the consequences. The folly of this belief was exposed as the southern tip of Manhattan disappeared amid smoke and flames. A similar statement by the SWP Central Committee, which was released 4 days after 7/7, questions how could 4 ordinary young men from Yorkshire be driven to blow themselves up in London? For Blair and Bush, they were barbarians at war with, in inverted commas, our civilization. The SWP Central Committee say, look, the answer here is that they witnessed the real barbarity of US, British, Israeli imperialism. Both statements, post 9/11, post 7/7, avoid condemnation of the attacks. Absolutely avoid condemnation of the attacks by framing them as misguided ventings of otherwise explicable anger. Now there's a critical problem here, and it's this: by analysing all that is retrograde in the world as merely a product of capitalism, as merely a product of an imperialist regime, means substituting vigorous Marxist theory, vigorous Marxist analysis for a fatalist prostration, a shrug of the shoulders that effectively evades politics. That is politics which is defined as identifying what products of capitalism to base ourselves on in their conflict with what others. And of course the working class is a product of capitalism, right? Propping up the SWP's inverted dual camp is a twofold analysis of imperialism and anti-imperialism, including the anti-war movement and Islamism. Both Lenin's and Bukharin's classical accounts of imperialism are claimed to be relevant in explaining the nature of imperialism today, as a synthesis of geopolitical rivalry between states and economic competition between capitals. Never mind the fact that these accounts were written when capitalism was not, like it is today, truly universal. As such, I would argue a more realistic assessment of what we see today is an imperialism of free trade, driven by the dull compulsion of economic forces. Military force is not an ultimate driver. It's applied as and when necessary. Anyway, back to the SWP thesis. Proceeds ahead of the game in this classic contemporary inter-imperialist rivalry is the grand strategy of the US administration, upholding US geopolitical superiority and imposing an Anglo-American model of free market capitalism, all of which by military might. On anti-imperialism then, and I draw upon a document written by John Rees in 2001, the SWP argue the following. The decision on, and I'm quoting John Rees here, the decision on whether or not to oppose imperialism, his words, cannot be based on whether or not we find the past or present behaviour of the opposing regime to be progressive. Instead, it is determined by the totality of relations in the system at any one point. Let's just recap Rees's argument. Whether or not to oppose imperialism can't be based on whether or not we find the past or present behaviour of the opposing regime to be progressive. It is determined by the totality of relations in the system at any given moment. What's peculiar actually about this quote is that the very fact that revolutionary socialists oppose imperialism appears to be in question. But actually what's being suggested here is that in the global imbalance of forces, we need to side with the counterweight against the heavyweight. That's the SWP argument. Yet, as Martin Thomas of Workers' Liberty puts it, surely a socialist commitment to equality does not mean we are obliged to boost our weaker enemies to bring them on par with our stronger ones. If we put this in the context of Draper's points that I mentioned earlier, in which, by the way, opposition to imperialism is taken as a given, the issue is whether or not a movement, organisation or government opposing an imperialist power should be offered political and, whenever feasible, military support. And this decision is based on the politics of which the war is a continuum on all sides. Post 9/11, the SWP has set itself, almost immediately, it set itself the task of radicalising an anti-capitalist milieu into a particular kind of anti-war and ultimately anti-imperialist movement. By their own assessment, the Stop the War coalition was an execution of what they referred to at the time as a broad united front. Actually, wasn't, and it isn't a broad united front, it's actually a Stalinist popular front, whereby the party poses as Martin Thomas puts it, the champion of unity at all costs and the archenemy of divisive debate, while at the same time siphoning recruits by virtue of organisational weight and prestige. Decisively, this so-called broad united front, as the SWP put it, is defined by the SWP Central Committee as follows. And they say this about the broad united front in a statement in 2001. Unity of the basis of opposition to war alone, without the addition of other planks, for example, condemnation of terrorism, that may exclude some important and potential allies and that implied that the main enemy is anyone but Western imperialism. Recap, right? Unity of the basis of opposition to war alone, i.e. imperialism, without the addition of other planks, for example, condemnation of terrorism, i.e. in this instance, I think, Islamism, that may exclude some important potential allies, and also implies the main enemy is anyone but Western imperialism. So goes the SWP argument. So this broad united front, aka popular front, enables the possibility to unite with virtually any self-declared anti-imperialist force, sentiment or language because of a shared enemy. It is classic politics of my enemy's enemy is my friend. The very root, in fact, of the early Stop the War coalition alliance with the Muslim Association of Britain, which had links with the Muslim Brotherhood, and also the root of the Stop the War coalition's early fervent support of Hezbollah, and one of its notable slogans, "We are all Hezbollah, boycott Israel," and their support for the Islamist Iraqi resistance. Now, in a definitive document that was produced by the SWP on Islamism, The Prophet and the Proletariat, in 1994, Harman criticises both the left in countries such as Iran, Egypt and Algeria for their outright dismissal of Islamism as a form of fascism, and the left in closer to home as well. And Harman says Islamist movements in the schematic global imbalance of forces, with the imperialist heavyweights going head to head with the anti-imperialist counterweight, are, I quote, often involved in direct armed confrontation with the forces of the state. And far from being direct agents of imperialism, these movements have taken up anti-imperialist slogans and some anti-imperialist actions which have embarrassed very important national and international capitalist interests. So it's this, following Harman's argument, it is this contradictory impulse of Islamist movements towards reform and revolution, which the SDPP concede ultimately immobilise them as a social force for radical change. But, and there is a twofold and very important but that the SDPP stress, socialists, I quote, cannot regard these petty bourgeois utopians as our prime enemies. Why? Again, I quote Harman, they are not responsible for the system of international capitalism. Socialists cannot regard these petty bourgeois utopians, i.e. Islamists, as our prime enemies because they are not responsible for the system of international capitalism. Alas, echoing Trotsky, here once again the SWP display fatalist prostration, a shrugging of the shoulders. Moreover, Harman adds, since Islamists grow on the soil of very large social groups that suffer under existing society, their feeling of revolt can be tapped for progressive purposes. Here the SWP epitomise classic popular front opportunism, and a politically compromised one at that. The Labour Party of Pakistan conclude of the early Stop the War Coalition alliance with the Muslim Association of Britain the following. British Trotskyists have tended during their alliance with the MAB and the anti-war movement to do the following. 1. Mixing banners and placards in a literal as well as figurative sense. 2. Minimising the importance of the elements of their political identity likely to embarrass their fundamentalist allies of the day. And finally, 3. Treating these temporary allies as if they were strategic allies in renaming anti-imperialists, in inverted commas, those whose vision of the world corresponds much more to a clash of civilisations than to class struggle. Okay, I want to offer some conclusions in the spirit of the politics of workers' liberty. Very important, I think, for understanding and adequately responding to our current political climate domestically and internationally. Workers' liberty stand by the basic principles that I outlined in the first part of the talk by Trotsky and Draper. We stand by a Marxist commitment to forging an independent political alliance body, if you like, by and for the interests of workers internationally, uncompromised in its commitment to securing the future of humanity, unyielding in its commitment to the principles of secularism, feminism, consistent democracy, and so on. We have persistently argued within the anti-war milieu for international solidarity with political forces that are engaged in courageous struggles, direct courageous struggles against Islamism and imperialism. We in Workers' Liberty recognise that it's precisely because Islamist movements have historically proven themselves, historically and in present day, proven themselves to be capable of the mass repression of the working class, the mass repression, the bloody suppression of politically progressive forces, which makes an analogy of Islamism to fascism credible. And it's those leftist forces and countries which directly face active Islamist movements which actually recognise this fact most starkly. Okay, I'm going to end it there. Thank you.